When I got the call that my HOA had rented out my home to strangers while I was deployed overseas, I thought it was a sick joke. But when I learned they'd changed the locks and pocketed the cash, my platoon and I decided to take matters into our own hands. Nobody messes with a soldier's home and gets away with it. My name is Ethan Carter, and this is the story of how my life turned upside down while I was serving my country, and how the brothers I fought alongside helped me set it right. I'm a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army, and back in early 2023, I was deployed to a forward operating base in the Middle East. It was my third tour, and I'd seen my fair share of chaos, but nothing could have prepared me for the mess waiting back home. I'd bought a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in North Carolina just before my deployment. It was a modest 3-bedroom place, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I'd saved for years to afford it, and it was my anchor, a place to come back to after months of sand and gunfire. The neighborhood had a homeowners association, which I thought was just there to make sure people mowed their lawns and didn't paint their houses neon green. I paid my dues on time, followed their rules, and figured they'd leave me alone while I was gone. I was wrong. About 6 months into my deployment, I got an email from a neighbor, Mrs. Delgado. She was a sweet older lady who'd always wave when I was home. Her message was short but hit like a gut punch. "Ethan, there's a family living in your house. I thought you sold it, but something feels off. Call me when you can." I read it twice, thinking it had to be a mistake. I hadn't sold my house. I hadn't even listed it. I was in a war zone, for God's sake. How could anyone be living in my home? I couldn't call right away. We were in the middle of a tense operation, and personal calls weren't exactly a priority. But Mrs. Delgado's words gnawed at me. When I finally got a chance to reach her, the story she told made my blood boil. A couple with 2 kids had moved into my house about a month earlier. They had a moving truck, new furniture, the works. She'd asked them if they'd bought the place, and they said no, they were renting it through the HOA. Renting my house. I hadn't authorized any rental. I hadn't even talked to the HOA since I'd left. I called my bank first, thinking maybe someone had hacked my mortgage account or forged my signature. Everything was in order. My payments were still coming out automatically, and there was no record of any sale or lease. Then I tried calling the HOA's office. It took 3 tries to get someone on the line, and when I did, it was some guy named Greg, who sounded like he'd rather be anywhere else. I explained the situation, and he put me on hold for what felt like forever. When he came back, he said, "Oh, yeah, your property's in our rental program. We sent you a notice about it." A notice? I was in a combat zone, not checking my mailbox. I told him I'd never agreed to any rental program, never signed anything, and sure as hell didn't want strangers in my house. Greg mumbled something about standard procedure and said he'd look into it. I demanded he evict the tenants immediately, but he just said, "It's not that simple," and promised to call me back. He never did. By now, I was livid. I called my platoon's legal officer, Captain Ramirez, who was back at our stateside base. He said it sounded like fraud or at least gross negligence and promised to dig deeper. A few days later, he emailed me a bombshell. The HOA had a vacant property management clause buried in their bylaws, which they claimed gave them the right to lease out homes that appeared unoccupied for more than 3 months, without the owner's explicit consent. They'd classified my house as vacant because I hadn't responded to their letters, which, again, I never saw because I was deployed. They'd forged a lease agreement with my name on it, rented my house to this family for $2,500 a month, and were keeping every cent. I felt violated. This wasn't just about money, it was my home. My dog tags hung on the bedroom wall. My dad's old toolbox was in the garage. Every memory I had of building a life outside the Army was in that house, and these people were treating it like their personal piggy bank. I wanted to hop on the next plane home, but I had 4 months left on my tour. All I could do was stew and plan. That's when my platoon got involved. My squad was like family, guys I'd trusted with my life through firefights and IED sweeps. We'd been through hell together, and when I told them what was happening, they were as pissed as I was. My squad leader, Sergeant First Class Jamal Tate, was the first to speak up. "Carter, when we get back, we're fixing this. Nobody screws over one of us like that." The others nodded, Corporal Mike Ski Kowalski, Specialist Danny Ruiz, and Private First Class Chris Kid Harper. They started calling it Operation Homefront, half joking but dead serious. Over the next few months, we pieced together a plan. Captain Ramirez kept working the legal angle, sending cease and desist letters to the HOA and filing complaints with the state. But the HOA dragged their feet, claiming the lease was binding until it expired in a year. A year. I wasn't waiting that long. My platoon and I decided that when we rotated back to the States, we'd take direct action. Nothing illegal, at least, not outright, but we weren't going to let bureaucracy screw me over. We got back to North Carolina in November 2023. I hadn't seen my house in over a year, and I wasn't even sure what to expect. The five of us, me, Tate, Ski, Ruiz, and Harper, piled into Tate's pickup and drove to my neighborhood. It was surreal pulling up to my own street, seeing my house with someone else's car in the driveway. There were kids' bikes on the lawn, a new mailbox, even a damn welcome mat that wasn't mine. It felt like I was trespassing on my own property. We didn't want to scare the tenants. From what Mrs. Delgado had told me, they were a regular family who thought they'd signed a legit lease. The real enemy was the HOA. So, step one was getting the tenants out without causing a scene. Tate, who could talk his way out of anything, took the lead. He knocked on the door, and a guy in his 30s answered, looking confused. Tate explained who I was, showed him my deed and military ID, and laid out the situation. The guy, Tom, was shocked. He said the HOA had told him the owner was permanently relocated, and the house was available long-term. They'd paid a deposit and 6 months' rent up front. Tom was pissed, but not at us. He invited us in, and his wife, Sarah, showed us the lease they'd signed. My signature was on it, but it was clearly forged. My name was misspelled, for one thing. I felt bad for them. They'd been duped just like I had. Tate convinced them to vacate by the end of the week, promising we'd help them get their money back from the HOA. They agreed, mostly because they didn't want to be caught in the middle of whatever we were planning next. With the tenants on board, we turned our attention to the HOA. Their office was in a strip mall 10 minutes away, a little glass-fronted place with their logo plastered on the door. We showed up the next morning, all 5 of us in our ACUs. We weren't trying to intimidate anyone, but we knew the uniforms would get attention. Greg, the guy I'd talked to on the phone, was at the front desk. He went pale when he saw us. I laid into him, demanding to know who authorized the rental, who forged my signature, and where my money was. Greg stammered, saying it was above his pay grade, and that the board president, a woman named Karen Whitaker, made the call. He gave us her number and address, probably hoping we'd leave. We did, but not before Ski, accidentally, knocked over a stack of their brochures. Karen Whitaker lived in a McMansion at the edge of the neighborhood. We drove there straight from the office. She answered the door in yoga pants and a wineglass, looking annoyed until she saw our uniforms. Then she got defensive. I told her I wanted my house back, the tenants out, and every cent they'd made from the rental. She tried to play innocent, saying the HOA was protecting my property by renting it out and that I'd benefit from the income. I asked where that income was, since I hadn't seen a dime. She didn't have an answer. Tate stepped in, calm but firm. He told her we had proof of the forged lease, statements from the tenants, and a lawyer ready to bury the HOA in lawsuits. If she didn't cooperate, we'd go to the police, the media, and every veterans group in the state. That got her attention. She started backpedaling, saying it was a misunderstanding and she'd make it right. We gave her 48 hours to evict the tenants officially, return my keys, and cut me a check for the full rental income, $15,000, based on 6 months at $2,500. She didn't meet the deadline. Big mistake. The next day, we escalated. Ruiz, who was a wizard with tech, dug into the HOA's public records and found Karen had a history of shady deals, skimming dues, hiring her friends for overpriced contracts, the works. We printed flyers with the details and handed them out at the neighborhood's community center. By evening, half the residents were calling for her resignation. Meanwhile, Ski and Harper staked out my house to make sure the tenants were packing up. They were, but the HOA had sent a locksmith to change the locks again, trying to keep me out. That's when we decided to stop playing nice. We weren't breaking any laws, but we were done asking permission. Tate called a buddy who owned a towing company, and we had the tenant's car moved to a nearby lot, just enough to send a message. Then I called a locksmith of my own, a guy who'd served in the Marines. He got me back into my house that night. Walking inside was bittersweet. The place smelled different, looked different. Someone else's life had been lived here. But it was still mine. We helped the tenants finish moving out the next day, and I gave them Captain Ramirez's number to go after the HOA for their deposit. They were grateful, and I was just glad to have my space back. Karen and the HOA didn't go quietly. They sent me a letter threatening legal action, claiming I'd interfered with their rental agreement. But by then, the flyers had done their job. Neighbors were furious, and the HOA board was fracturing. Karen resigned a week later, and Greg was fired. Captain Ramirez filed a lawsuit on my behalf, and we settled out of court for $20,000, $15,000 for the rent they'd collected, plus $5,000 for damages. I used the money to fix up the house and donate to a veterans charity. My platoon and I celebrated at my place that Christmas. We grilled in the backyard, cracked open some beers, and toasted to Operation Homefront. Those guys didn't just help me take back my house. They reminded me what brotherhood means. The HOA's still there, but they're under new management, and nobody's tried to pull anything like that again. At least, not on my watch. If there's one thing I learned, it's this: you can't always trust the people who say they're looking out for you. Sometimes, you've got to fight for what's yours. And when you do, it helps to have a few good soldiers at your back.